I hope that everyone is doing well. Welcome to the August 3rd, 2021 Teaching and Learning Committee meeting of the Baltimore City Board of School Commissioners. I am Ronald McFadden, and I will be leading our discussions today, because we really have Chief Jones who's here to focus on the assessment strategy for school year 21-22. And then, of course, we have some procurement items on our agenda for today. Chief Jones, if you are ready, we are ready. And certainly, if you want to take a few more moments than the 20 that have been allotted for you, I know that this is a healthy presentation. So feel free to do that because you're the only person on our agenda today besides procurement.
Great. Great. So good afternoon, Vice Chair McFadden and Chair of our Teaching and Learning Board Committee. It's great to be with everyone today. First, let me just acknowledge that Dr. Dabrowski will be joining us. She is with the School Leaders Institute right at the moment. So I'm going to take the liberty of kicking this off, and certainly will invite her to add additional comments and be present for questions as we go through the presentation. I also want to acknowledge that two of our colleagues are really going to take the lion's share of the presentation today, Aquila James and Heather Nolan. They truly have been at the forefront of coordinating across offices to develop the assessment strategy that you will hear about today. As it relates to the strategy itself, what you should expect today is number one, you'll be reminded around where our assessment philosophy really puts the stake in the ground around how we view assessments and their role as it relates to teaching and learning, as well as the guiding principles that govern how we make decisions about assessments and how they are utilized. You'll also hear more about the details regarding the assessments that are being put forth for this upcoming year. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, I just made sure my camera was off too. I didn't know if that was it, but I heard what you said.
Okay, great. And then also we want to be able to put into context the work that we are doing around Reconnect, Restore, and Reimagine, and what it means not only for the assessments themselves, but how the work connects as it relates to our data inquiry process and how individuals will be utilizing the assessment information to inform decisions about what students need and how they can be supported as we work through our recovery efforts in this upcoming year. So let's move to the next slide, please. So first and foremost, around our philosophy. So first and foremost, we do want to acknowledge that students truly are at the center of the work that we do around teaching and learning, as well as specifically as it relates to assessments. And so what we've listed here is our fundamental belief around assessments being student-centered, and that in order for assessments to be not only administered and utilized appropriately, but for them to truly demonstrate the value of which they have been created, it does require a commitment of multiple stakeholders, which create opportunities for students when it comes to their ability to demonstrate their learning, to demonstrate the growth that they have experienced, as well as the mastery of the content and standards for which they have been taught. We also recognize that assessments, to be truly effective, have to be inherent in how we do teaching and learning work. And so this idea of having ongoing, meaningful assessments that are delivered through various forms that truly are purpose driven when it comes to the provision of timely feedback for students and those that are instructing them. And that feedback can then inform instructional decisions and inform the programmatic needs for our learners, as well as the decisions that we have to make as a district. We also recognize that, particularly in response to COVID, we're sort of in a unique time where assessments truly are going to be critical when it comes to our ability to truly understand where our students are starting and where and how we can take them to where they need to go. So first and foremost, our charge, we do need to identify strengths as well as needs as it relates to the unfinished learning that may have transpired over these last 16 or 18 months. We need to be able to do that in a timely fashion. And we need to be able to have that data inform standards-based instruction and personalized learning. And so I know with the most recent presentation around the Reconnect, Restore, and Reimagine plan, we really did highlight the importance of personalized learning and to have accelerated learning experiences for our students. And so the work that you're going to hear about today will give you an indication around how we're going to move in that direction. And we also acknowledge that there are going to be a lot of things that we're going to learn in this upcoming year that will inform adjustments, all with an eye towards being able to support students that have had that unfinished learning. We also recognize the importance for families to really understand where their students are and how they are also partners in supporting our students. And so again, thinking about how that data can provide feedback to students and families so that families can understand what students' knowledge and skills are as it relates to grade level instruction and also their preparation for college and careers. Next slide, please. So when we talk about assessments really being fundamental when it comes to, or part of the foundation when it comes to teaching and learning, we just want to remind folks around this concept of the instructional core. And this really gets to the fact that when we think about instruction and we think about how assessments support instruction, it is to preserve the integrity of the instructional core, which of course starts first and foremost with an understanding of our students, what they know, what they need to know, and how they can be well supported. It is also then supported by our teachers and their ability to deliver the instruction as needed in order to help students grow in the areas that they need to and develop mastery. And then, of course, it is leveraging the resources or materials that are listed there as a way to make all of that work. And especially in light of where we've been, we recognize that now when we think about materials, that's not just about physical materials, that is also about how we use our online technology and other resources in order to support learning, both in school and outside of school, and both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. Next slide, please. And so here we just want to review several of the guiding principles that relate to this year's assessment strategy. First and foremost, the preservation of instructional time. We've always had attention around how assessments are being used and what that means in terms of time away from instruction. Again, we really want to make sure that we are maximizing instructional time and that as we deliver assessments, that we are prioritizing having assessments and the data that they generate really be closely connected to the timing of instruction. So you'll hear more about that when you hear about the assessments that are being proposed. Also, when it comes to optimizing, we recognize the role of professional learning for our educators to both support their use of data to improve their practice, but also in light of the recovery to support our students when it comes to an accelerated learning experience. When it comes to leveraging, we also call it leverage as a principle, and this recognizes that it takes all of our stakeholders working together in order to deliver successful instruction and help our students to learn. And that also means that we're not only just thinking about as we're going through the process of instructing and assessing, but also in feedback to that, so that we have family and student and educator voice and input as we continue to work through this upcoming year. When it comes to consider, we also have to consider the operational impact of professional development and our families. And then when it comes to alignment, we also continue to work towards aligning the development and engagement around assessments to our key test windows and with consideration to data availability when it comes to coordination of state assessments, college and career readiness assessments, for example, with advanced placement, with the SAT, with the ACT, and even with our diagnostic assessment, which we typically refer to as our beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year type of data. So again, just recognizing that there's a lot of alignment opportunities as we're working through this upcoming year with the other instructional strategies that are being put in place. Next slide, please. And the last but not least, before I turn it over to Aquila James, we also want to acknowledge the alignment of this work to the board's strategic priorities. And so when we think about the strategy, there's sort of three key pillars that are reflected on the left side. The first is the assessments themselves. The second being the data inquiry process, which really gets to the point of around how are the data being used to inform instructional decisions. And then thirdly, around communication and engagement. So again, recognizing the importance of having everyone working together in order to have a successful learning experience. And then we've mapped out the board's strategic priorities, which of course, as you see noted, include priorities 1, 4, 5, 1, 4, 6, and 7. And that covers the spectrum in terms of focus on rigorous instruction, how we engage with stakeholders that contribute to student success, how we also think about what those educational programming opportunities look like, and how we ensure a high quality educational experience. And then, of course, with the consideration towards equity. Equity is foundational to everything that we do. And so we do want to be mindful around how does equity get experienced as it relates to assessment decisions, the assessment experience, as well as how the assessment data are being used to support students. So I appreciate you listening to that overview. This provides some foundational grounding. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Aquila James, and she will talk to you more about the details of this upcoming year's strategy.
Well, thank you kindly. Thank you so much, Chief Jones, and greetings, commissioners. Appreciate it. All right, so the assessment strategy includes the use of 3 assessment types throughout the year. So we have summative, diagnostic, and formative assessments. And summative assessments are conducted at the end of the module or a quarter. And what they do is they provide both the teacher and student with data that highlights the student's knowledge and the application of content that was delivered during a set time. Teachers may use the summative assessment data to adjust pacing in order to gauge the whole class, small groups, as well as individual students' comprehension, and then consider ways for them to improve their instruction. These summative assessments that are laid before you include the Wit and Wisdom used on the Affirm platform, as well as the Eureka Math. And then the Data Link platform is used for our social studies and science. Next slide. Thank you. When we think about accelerated learning, we inherently think about the purpose of assessments. You're going to hear a little bit more about accelerated learning, but I just want to mention, as we have been thinking in terms of our R3 work, we've been thinking very deeply about accelerating the learning of our scholars. And so as we're thinking about that, we're inherently thinking about the purpose of assessment, especially the diagnostic assessments. And although the first 3 diagnostic assessments listed may look familiar, the assessment data and instructional direction may look different. And so those assessments include the Amplify, which you've heard, we've used that before, the iReady assessment, and last year also the Achieve 3000. And in the past, our approach to addressing unfinished learning was through remediation, which is based on this misconception that for students to learn new information, they must first go back to master everything they missed. But as we look forward to align the assessment strategy with the accelerated learning, our approach to collecting and using diagnostic data is to identify the highest priority prerequisite knowledge and skills to provide just-in-time instruction throughout the school year. Our curriculum-aligned diagnostics, such as the Eureka Math Equip that you see here, will support teachers in also quickly identifying those prerequisite skills that they will be introduced within the next week. And then they will be able to immediately adjust pacing and instruction, again, to provide that just-in-time learning. And before we go to the next slide, it's important to call attention to the Moby-Mac and WIDA diagnostic assessment, as they were selected to better assess our students with disabilities and English, students with disabilities, and as well as our English language learners. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we take a more closer look later during the presentation. All of these assessments are available both in person, and the preference is in person, but they're also available through our virtual learning program. And so both our scholars that are going to engage on the virtual learning program, as well as our in-person scholars, will be able to take these assessments. Next slide, please. I think you could go back to the formative assessment slide. Thank you so much. So formative assessment data is likened to what I would refer to as bread and butter in teaching and learning. Assessment for learning is best practice when we consider the instructional model previously discussed by Chief Jones. It creates consistent feedback used to improve students' performance as well as adult practice. And with standard aligned short cycled assessments, students become more involved in the learning process and confidence in what they are expected to learn and what the standard is. And so for ELA and math, teachers will use the curriculum assessments accessible through the Eureka Affirm platform as they did last year, and educators will continue to conduct formative assessments in both social studies and science for the purpose of capturing the in-the-moment understanding of content in the same fashion as last year. Again, the formative assessments provide our scholars and our teachers with a snapshot of student knowledge and insight that will inform pacing and immediate instructional scaffold opportunities. Our teachers will continue to use these assessments both in the virtual learning program as well as in person. All right, next slide. Thank you. This year, MSDS has provided expectations for assessing students at the beginning of the year and the end of year. And so with the new fall MCAP assessment, it's important to note that we not only understand, we completely understand the need to balance the assessments that our scholars are going to take, both the state assessments as well as the district's beginning of the year assessments. And so we've done our absolute best to calendar in a way that provides schools the time to get acclimated with being back in school, as well as to address and begin to establish culture, specifically the social emotional needs of both the students as well as the adults in the building. Now with this fall MCAP, we want to make sure that you guys are completely aware that we haven't quite received the level of information from the state yet as how that data, what that data will tell us or how it will inform instruction and or guidance with respect to curriculum. So we're still waiting for that, but we wanted to make sure that you guys are completely aware of what the state is asking. And so for grades pre-K through 8, you'll notice here on the left column for pre-K through 2, we have our pre-K early learning assessment, kindergarten readiness assessment, both our WIDA screener as well as the WIDA K, and the access for L's. And when we look further to the right, you'll notice that the assessments look a little bit similar. We have our early fall MCAP in ELA and math. And so that's for grades 4 through 5. And then for ELA and math in the spring as well, we'll continue with that assessment for grades 3 through 5. That also does include the alternate assessment, as well as our WIDA screener for grades 3 through 5 and our access for our L's in grades 3 through 5. That concludes the state assessments for pre-K through 5. Next slide, please. All right. And so for the district level assessments for the key K through 5th grade band, we wanted to provide you with a very explicit visual that allows you to see the combination of both the formative and summative, as well as the diagnostic assessments that the district is asking our K through 5 scholars when it comes to content specific and our special populations. And so again, for ELA and math, you're going to see that Amplify as well as the iReady assessment for the diagnostic. You'll also notice the Wit and Wisdom assessment, which is the curriculum assessment, as well as the math assessment. It's also our curriculum assessment. And so you'll go down, you'll notice that for grades K through 2, our social studies do not have an assessment there. And then for special populations, we offer additional assessments that will support students and their ability to participate in some of our most, and their ability to participate in our gifted program, as well as our ability to gauge our students who are L's. And then the category in the area, to the right, you'll notice that there's an Amplify assessment for grades 3 through 5, and Wit and Wisdom again for grades 3 through 5. For math, again, you see the iReady assessment, as well as the Eureka Equip and Affirm. That Eureka Equip and Affirm includes that diagnostic assessment, providing folks with that opportunity to engage in prerequisite skills and immediately respond to students' learning, coupled with the interims, the iQuest for science in the science area for grades 3 through 5. And again, in the special populations, the same assessments that you've noticed before, except there are quarterly writing assessments that allow our ELL teachers to most appropriately gauge the progress of our students after a set window of time. Okay, next slide, please. Again, MSDE has provided really good guidance as it relates to the fall assessment for both students in middle grades as well as high school for ELA and math. I just want to pause because I know that this slide looks a little meaty. I just want to give folks an opportunity to really gaze in. A couple things that I want to point as you're looking in is that the early fall MCAP assessment in ELA and math are for grades 6 through 8. In middle grades. And then for our scholars that in the 5th grade that did not take the Maryland Integrated Science Assessment, i.e. the MESA, they will be required in grade 6 to take that assessment. So if they didn't take it last year, they will be taking that assessment this year. For ELA and math, MCAP for spring assessment will continue with grades 6 through 8. They will engage in the traditional MCAP assessments coupled with the MESA for grade 8. And that does include that alternative assessment coupled with the programmatic or special population assessments, i.e. the leader screener and access for Ls. When we look at our high school scholars are also engaged in taking that early fall MCAP assessment in both ELA and math. Particularly students who took English 10 or Algebra 1 in school year 2021 will need to take that, which we are referring to often as the BOY MCAP. Early fall 2021 MESA students that did not take this in the 8th grade, they will be required to take the MESA, the fall MESA in grade 9. And then for our spring assessments, we have our ELA and math MCAP that will occur for our English 10 as well as Algebra 1 students, also including that alternative assessment coupled with the high school MESA and life science MESA spring, the government HSA, as well as the WEDA screen and access for Ls. Okay, next slide. So just to kind of look a little bit more intently and just focus our energy on grades 6 through 12. And we're just going to really pay close attention to the ELA and math assessments and the assessments for middle grades and high school, both. Again, the diagnostic assessment as well as some of the formative and summative assessments are located here. Again, we're really making sure that we maximize instruction to the best of our ability. And so it's important to note that the wit and wisdom assessments really will support that on-grade level assessment, as well as the Eureka Equip for math also supports the grade level assessments and giving teachers that information that they need to ensure that our students are accelerating well. Of course, our middle grade scholars are engaged in the iReady assessment, and that assessment for middle grades is BOY, MOY, and EOY. And when we look at our high schools, it's a little bit different. We still have that iReady assessment, and we're using the Achieve 3000 to support us in grades 12. As another diagnostic assessment, really wanting to ensure that we are providing as many opportunities as possible for both our teachers and our educators to understand and identify the learning loss and be able to quickly provide that just-in-time instruction. And so we're capitalizing on the iReady assessment data as well as the Achieve 3000 assessment data. The quarterly assessments are conducted in English 1 through 4. And so with that being said, those are summative assessments that will continue to inform our teachers as to how well our students are understanding the content. And when we look to our math area, again, we see iReady, we see Imagine Math. I'm sorry about that. That should say Imagine Math. for our math area, and it also reads for Eureka Equip and Affirm, and specifically our Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2 courses. And so for our probability and stats, we have the quarterly assessments that help the teacher and the student to also gauge how well the student is understanding content there. Okay, next slide, please. All righty, and so to further discuss with respect to grades 6 through 12, content and special population assessment, social studies for middle grades and high school offer a course pre-assessment. This assessment is going to help provide additional information for the teacher in understanding what standards and skills the student has as they're entering into learning this new module. So there's a pre-assessment that both the students engage in, and the teacher uses that that data to support pacing, as well as additional scaffolds that might be necessary. In social studies, our scholars do take interim assessments. Again, those interim assessments are conducted at the end of the module, which usually, end of the quarter. And teachers will use that for long-term planning. And so will the district. The district likes to use that also to glean and learn as well. Science interims will be provided to both middle grades as well as high school. It's important to note that the interims for high school are for biology, chemistry, and physics. Those interims are conducted at the end of the quarter, similarly to what social studies uses that same type of timeline. And for our special populations in both areas, we're noticing just a need to ensure that we have offered specific assessments that will allow teachers to capture all students learning. And so when we think in terms of the WIDA model, we're thinking about our English language learners, and we're thinking how can we use that assessment data to support our day-to-day instruction. And so our scholars are involved and they do participate in that assessment. Coupled with that assessment is that ESOL quarterly writing assessment. That quarterly writing assessment really hones in on skills that WIDA assesses, coupled with content. And so students are going to engage in a writing assessment that allows the teacher to gauge how well they're understanding the content, coupled with the traditional speaking, writing, and listening skills that WIDA assesses. When it comes to our students with disabilities, as shared earlier, we are super excited to continue our partnership with MobyMax and offer that assessment so that our students can easily use the tools that allow them to access the assessment. I think when we think in terms of our students with a disability, sometimes assessing them well can be a challenge, but we're very appreciative that MobyMax offers resources and scaffolds within that allows our students to quickly access that and show their learning. And of course, I have to say that this goes without saying, the district continues to see a growing population of students taking advanced placement courses, and that's a big and major accomplishment, and we're excited about that. And naturally, the courses include the end of the course, if you will, assessment. And so we will make sure that AP assessment continues this year and supports our scholars in this year and beyond as they go on to matriculate to post-secondary learning. All righty, next slide, please. All right, I am really excited to present this. You've heard me mention accelerated learning to you earlier, and I'm confident that you've heard the same during last week's presentation when discussing the R3 work. And I want to present to you guys today what we are defining as our accelerated learning model. Our accelerated learning model gives students the skills that they need for tasks and lessons at hand, with the understanding that not every or all of the prerequisite skills that teachers will identify via diagnostic assessments, it doesn't necessarily, I'm sorry, not every or all prerequisite skills allow us to kind of hone in on all standards, if you will. We really want to laserly focus on the prerequisite skills, and we're using specific assessment data in order to do so. And so what you have before you is this learning model that implicitly it is a process of acceleration in which students are capable of learning more while struggling less. And so it's this notion of understanding that students are going to learn more if they struggle less. And so the key driving question that we find ourselves asking us as we think about accelerated learning is, what does a student need to be successful at the task or in the lesson? And so first we start with the prioritizing the standards, and then we identify the prerequisite skills that the students need. And not all of this of the standards, but the essential ones. And then next, what we find ourselves doing is diagnosing students to determine what they know and can do and what they need to be successful. We provide them with prerequisite and use the structures to support them for grade level core instruction. Again, you are going to hear a lot more about our accelerated learning model, particularly as we talk about or we present with the R3 model. But I wanted to make sure that we put this before you because our assessment strategy is in concert with the accelerated learning model. All right, next slide, please. All right, so a key component to moving along that arrow that we just looked at is the teacher's ability to access and analyze the learning. And so we realize the importance of consistently monitoring students' learning now more than ever. And so therefore, we've intentionally adjusted this year's school calendar to include professional development days just after the diagnostic, non-curricular assessment diagnostics, that is, to provide opportunities for teachers to dig into the data and take immediate action. Teachers are very familiar with the data cycle, and they engage in steps 1 and 3, I might say readily. They assess students' learning. They certainly look to analyze what their students are showing on their throughout the class day, more specifically on assessments, and they are working to apply and communicate that learning. And so I want to just say that we do recognize that although some staff and some teachers engage in this data cycle, there's a variance in what educators and leaders understand when using data to support and inform instruction. And at the district level, we're looking more keenly at leveraging professional development to support our educators on assessment administration use and analysis. Next slide. And because we do acknowledge that we can't just give assessments and not provide the structure, process, and time for educators and leaders to engage in data inquiry and continuous improvement, we knew we needed to broaden our reach and partner with educators, school leaders, and coaches, as well as district leaders, to discuss and identify our approach to using data to improve student outcomes and adult practices. And so we've discussed our capacity to take on the work and are now fashioning ourselves to engage in what you see phase 1 and phase 2 include. We'll talk about that in a minute, but we're looking in terms of fashioning ourselves to partner with a vendor to support the district in establishing the right structures and data inquiry practices. And so if you take a look at phase 1, what we want to do is build on that accelerated learning model and use high quality instructional materials, which I must say we have, and effective data inquiry processes, which we're looking to establish. We want to also leverage highly effective evidence-based practices. And so we believe in just looking at the pool of folks that we have in city schools and really gleaning from best practices that teachers and schools already have. And so we want to partner with those folks that are doing it well and leverage what they have to offer during our phase one. We want to also provide targeted coaching and support to enact data-wise and continuous improvement to solve our problems of practice. The data-wise improvement process is the data inquiry structure that this small group and I have decided, along with our chiefs, have decided to go along and use that improvement practice in order to engage in data inquiry and continuous improvement throughout our district. For phase two, what we hope to do is align our resources and professional development to achieve the vision. And so again, we know that this year has already started in a major way, a very positive way. And in year two, we want to make sure that we're aligning resources. We're learning from what our teachers engaged in during phase one. We're learning from them and aligning resources, making some adjustments based off of their feedback so that we can work to achieve the vision that we've outlined with respect to data inquiry. Of course, we want to and look forward to a high level of engagement and participation and attendance for our phase one schools so that we again document that process and really engage in continuous improvement and learning. And then phase three includes just an increased knowledge of data and inquiry and continuous improvement. Again, just a nice build. Each year, we want to step back and assess our learning and ensure that the practices that we're implementing are the best practices that support our scholars as well as our educators and their pedagogical practices. And of course, we look forward to in phase three, our school teams having the support to explore barriers to student achievement. All righty. Okie dokie. And one more slide, last but certainly not least, is engaging student families and community. I want to just say that this work is probably the most exciting work when we engage our students, our families and communities. And throughout this, throughout the R3 work, I want to just share, we've been really intentional around focusing on personalized learning plans and thinking in terms of how to use those plans, what data to capture to help support the plans, the creation of those plans in order to engage both our students and families and really personalizing the support. And so using the assessment data is just one of the forms of measuring to help to outline personalized learning plans for our scholars and families. Capitalizing on Family University so that our families are aware of how to read the assessment data reports and how to be engaged and support their scholars throughout this year as their children look to engage in the diagnostic, the summative, as well as the formative assessments. And of course, we are very happy, I should say, to think in terms of the district committee on assessments and really think about how we partner with that nice committee and think about our assessments and have them engage, or I should say, share with us survey results this year. We were able, I'm sorry, I want to back up real quick. We were able to partner with the DCA on assessments. And throughout this year, we took a look at the experience that our teachers were having as they were conducting the assessments this year and our scholars, and really looked at that data to help support in the proposal of today's assessment strategy and learning from the different stakeholders' perspective as to what the assessments may mean for them. And that continues to be ongoing work. And of course, when it comes to our campus portal, we want to make sure that our families are keenly aware of data and they're able to access that data real time. So again, in partnership with our families, our students, and our communities, we want to ensure that we are working in step with one another as folks are working very hard to ensure that students are going to be successful instructionally this year. All right, any questions? And next slide. Chief Jones, or I don't know if Chief Dabrowski, if you were able to join, if you want to add before we open it up. If not, we are welcome. Commissioner, turn it right back over to you.
I don't have any questions. I'm happy just to listen in to any questions from the board.
Thank you for the presentation. So it's really important. This presentation today is really important as we are coming out of the pandemic, out of this historic tragic series of global health events. So it's really important, and thinking about you know, some of the things that our young people have missed, right? I'm not looking at any of this as deficits, so to speak, because I think that our young people are brilliant, and I think that we have the capacity to grow their skills and to strengthen their skills. So I'm not looking at, you know, going into this year with our young people as having deficits, but I appreciate the diagnostic information that you all are focusing on, right? That's critically important. And anyone that is in a school right now knows how critically important the diagnostic assessments are. But this is a lot of testing, right? And for MCAP to be both in the spring and in the fall, like that's a lot. So I'm assuming that MCAP in the fall is assessing previous year knowledge. Is that correct? So that's one thing. But before I go into that, have we looked at how much time is going to be taken from instruction in order to assess our students?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know if it's in the appendix, but I know that I've seen multiple where we've actually done the full analysis for every single one of our with how much time it takes to administer and what that time is. So I don't know, Quilla, is that included here, or we certainly have that in a separate spreadsheet?
We certainly have that in a separate spreadsheet. I do not think that it's included in the appendix.
Not in the appendix. I would be, hey, Commissioner Griffin, I would be interested in seeing exactly how much time we are taking to focus on assessment. I understand the importance of having that diagnostic information, having the formative information. You know, I understand the importance. It's just, for me, I want to see where it all lies within the scope of the year. I know that the assessments are important, but I also know that the high quality instruction is, I won't say even more important, but it's really important given where we've just come out of. Chief Jones?
Yep.
Yes, I wanted to acknowledge that because you're absolutely correct. Like, there has been a tension as long as I've been in this work around how time is being used and what does that mean for the assessment experience. And I will say one of the biggest challenges is when you look at the types of assessments that we're using, many of them are computer adaptive. And so there's sort of a dynamic that plays out differently in terms of the student's experience, depending on how, their level of skill and, content mastery. So I just want to acknowledge that and just name it, that even though we have tried to create some estimates, I just want to be clear, like, they are not perfect. Yeah. Student experiences will vary for a variety of reasons. And what we've tried to do is to do our best on the front end to help schools prepare so that they can try to adjust time as best they can so that it can be minimally disruptive, as well as to try to preserve as much of that instructional time as possible. But there's no silver bullet for how we can best address this. But I think having people's awareness of that challenge, I think being mindful of it, and in particular trying to the administration experience so that it is not more cumbersome than it absolutely has to be, will continue to be a part of our work. And I just want to acknowledge that.
I appreciate that. I think I'm challenged with the fall MCAT, right? And so this is me just taking a personal moment, right? So I know that I understand, I get it. But I feel like that decision could have been left up. This is me personally speaking, could have been left up to individual jurisdictions to decide based on the spring MCAP that's coming up. How are we going to assess the knowledge that our young people? No, Chief, I know you're going to get me together with this. That's why you raised your hand up again. But how are we going to get our students to go ahead. I mean, that's just my frustration, because when I think I'm in a building in September, October, I'm not, that's a process, right? Where we're trying to develop strong culture and relationships and processes, and really develop all of that, to put testing at the beginning of the school year, like standardized state mandated testing at the beginning of the school year. It's challenging for me to grapple with. Chief Jones.
Yes, I mean, what you're grappling with, we are grappling with as well. So let me just name that. And I say that with all due respect to MSDE and our state board. It has been really tough in some ways for them to be able to say that they have an understanding statewide around how students are doing. And in light of the pandemic, they thought that it was really important that there be a statewide assessment that could be used to be able to understand how students are starting the year. So that is to a large extent the reason that the fall administration was actually put forth. They did try to give consideration to the time, so they tried to decrease the amount of time, and they've shortened the actually assessments themselves in recognition of that. But that was one of the biggest considerations. And then on top of that, to their credit, they were actually submitting requests for waivers from the feds on the ESSA requirements around administration of assessments. And we just learned that their request to have the MISA, which was that science assessment, waived, was not accepted. And so that was one of the newest developments, is that has now been added in. And that was reflected in the chart that you saw today. So again, I'm just acknowledging that, there are a lot of competing interests here. And this question around the ability for individuals at various levels to really understand what's happening with students is such a priority that, unfortunately, in many ways, assessments are one of the efficient, in some ways, tools we have to be able to understand that. As imperfect as they are, they do help inform other decisions, and they do provide value in some ways. So again, I just want to acknowledge what you're saying. I want to just share the information that I have, and just acknowledge that there's also more information that we will be receiving around what that looks like, and how that data will come back to us. But they have tried to be responsive to the need for folks to be able to get results quickly. So what we are anticipating is, with those fall administrations, that for those computer generated items, that there will be a more immediate access to those data. But then scoring might come a little bit later. And that the fall version of the MCAP may very well look different than the spring version of the MCAP, because again, the spring version of the MCAP is the one that will be used for accountability purposes. And that is something we don't want to lose sight of. So it is an unusual year that the state is asking us to administer twice, potentially with two different formats of assessments. And that's been a challenge for us as we think about our need for diagnostics at the beginning of the year as well. So that, again, being mindful of time, we can sequence those administration times so that it can be minimally disruptive, but also be able to advise our educators around what to do with the data that are coming from these different assessments.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Griffin. I'm coming right to you. Whatever we need to do to support school leaders and school teams in making sure, to your point, Chief Jones, that this is as minimally intrusive, right, into the instructional program as possible. I think we really have to do that. And then you also mentioned something that I was thinking about, right? Generally, when we take these standardized assessments, we don't really get the information from them for quite a bit of time. So to your point, hopefully, because we're more digitalized, we could perhaps get some of that information sooner to kind of support the rest of our instructional programming throughout the course of the year that leads up to that spring assessment. Commissioner Griffin?
Yes, I've been nodding my head vigorously to this discussion because it was something that I thought about too. In looking at how to map out what a student's experience and or an educator's experience would be for the testing timelines. And so, you know, when we think about like games on the gaming console, or we think about certain experiences, there's always like a user experience that's mapped out. And I think it would be helpful to map out a user experience in the terms of our students and our educators to see like, okay, if we have a student who is in, you know, pre-K through 3, what is their experience when it comes to assessments? What does that look like when we go through the first quarter, the second quarter, the third quarter, the fourth quarter? How much time windows, we know there may be, you know, ranges, would they actually spend testing versus in class? And then when we have to think about our educators with this too, because it interrupts your teaching schedule. It interrupts your scope and sequence. You have, you know, your regular educational program that you're teaching, and then you also have a certain amount of prep that you have to do with your students, especially if we're talking about using computers and helping them walk through any of the issues that come with technology and frustration with tests. Like there's a lot of prep that goes into making sure your students are ready to feel comfortable in their skin and take these tests. And then on top of that, making sure that you've also covered whatever is necessary when we're talking about these spring assessments and the rest of the assessments that come with your course for the district. So I'm just throwing out there an idea that would help everyone see what this really looks like, because it's one thing to kind of map out how long a test takes individually, but it's another thing to take an actual student and say, student A is in the 2nd grade, and okay, first week back, they're getting a diagnostic. It takes such and such amount of time, but how many classes? How many classes are they taking diagnostics in a day, in a week? What does that do to a child's brain? How does that make them feel about their school? You know, we're coming off of a different type of year, so we have to be aware of that too. And then when we think about our high school students, there's a lot of pressure. You know, there's a lot of pressure that comes with a lot of our high school students and our students who are going to go through the school choice process. And so thinking about how we're also supporting them and supporting schools and supporting students with the testing windows, with the stress of coming back to school, with the stress of knowing that this test might determine what high school they can go to, what college they can go to, like all of that comes into play. But that was my biggest piece that I just wanted to put out there, was a user experience map for educators and for students so that everybody can kind of see what it's feeling like, really.
Dr. Dabrowski?
Yes, no, those are really important questions, Commissioner Griffin. And I will say we do have what we call an assessment calendar, but I actually like the term like user, what you call it, user experience, because I think we map it and we do try to be really sensitive to when we put in, you know, when is the math interim, when is the ELA, so that they're not necessarily on top of each other. But to your point, it might be, well, this week I have math, next week I have ELA, then next week I have science. So there's some of it that is set up because of a quarter-based system, and those things tend to come up towards, and we do give windows, but your points are all well taken in terms of really needing to look at it in terms of volume and experience for the learner, and the lift on teachers is real. You know, getting them all set up to do it, there is a level of pressure. Even when we try to say it's a low stakes, the energy shifts. So I think you're naming all the things that we're feeling too. And I will say, as part of our reimagine, we are prioritizing stepping back to say, where can we give some pulling back on assessments, and some we don't have a choice. So when the state comes in and says, hey, you're doing a fall administration of, you know, that really does sort of, you know, lock us in. But where can we give permission for flexibility? We are very much in a space of wanting to look closely at that.
Chief Jones.
Yes, I just wanted to build on Dr. Dabrowski's comment and acknowledge that also at the school level, a lot of the work around scheduling of assessment activity and influencing how that student and teacher experience plays out is actually determined at the school level. So while we certainly do our part to try to create schedules, give guidance, et cetera, I also just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of differences by school by virtue of just the school dynamic when they're looking at the number of students in a given grade, the number of teachers. A lot of our assessments, again, are computer-based assessments. So there's been that question around how to use technology. And even though as a result of the pandemic, we have more technology in some ways in schools, there still has to be some catch up around some of our wireless connectivity in school buildings now that we'll have kids back. So I'm just acknowledging that even when we talk about user experience, a lot of how that actually plays out is influenced by school-based decisions, and we continuing to learn from schools so that those that are having success in managing these challenges have best practices, and we can communicate that to other schools so that, again, we can all get better and better about this. I just want to acknowledge that has been a lot of the work over the last several years, quite honestly, because we, up until this year, have not as much technology available to us to support the testing activity. So I think we are going to learn a lot from what happens this fall. And hopefully that'll put us in a better position to even improve experience going into the spring. Because I want to acknowledge like the points around the stakes plays out differently. Again, as you pointed out, Commissioner Griffin, like even students that are going through the choice process, but also just thinking about the spring window as our typical accountability window. And so really just thinking about to the extent that we can, make that an even better experience is something we want to be mindful of.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear you bring up the tech piece and knowing like we have increased the amount of tech, but knowing that the Wi-Fi, the bandwidth definitely needs to be at the right amount, that it's expansive enough to be able to receive all of that activity for testing at that time. So I do want to call that out because goodness gracious, do I remember doing some of this testing and all of the like bandwidth issues that may come about. And so at the forefront, like before we get to that point, knowing that we're handling those things or have already done that, can do some pre-testing of like, what's the bandwidth at each of these schools? Is it enough to actually withstand like 3 classes taking testing at the same time? What does that look like so that we don't get this bogged down of folks trying to log into test and getting logged out or kicked out at the same time. So I'm glad you brought that up as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge like that has been a primary focus area for our R3 investments. So if you look at our R3 plan, like that call out around technology and connectivity, there is a significant investment that we continue to make with those federal funds to make sure that we can get ourselves in a better position. I'm just acknowledging like we still have work to do to actually make that real. And so that is a focus for us, but I also don't want to overcommit in terms of all of that's going to be nailed by the time we get to the spring. Like, I think we still have to do some of that work, but knowing the importance of it is also guiding our tech team in their planning efforts.
I want to make sure that we bring in Mark Etienne, Mr. Etienne, who's been waiting to chime in. Mr. Etienne, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you? It's good to see you both.
It's good to see you also, and I think this might be the first time in the Teaching and Learning Committee meeting that we've had you as the new ED of Teaching and Learning with us. So welcome, but I know that you are eager to chime in, so please do.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Chief Jones really said what I was going to say. What I will add is we are also trying to find ways to attack this problem from multiple angles because it is a really big problem. It's been a problem for a long time. One of the things we learned last year very closely, particularly around the idea of how teachers were trying to assess digitally or in person, was how much work the teacher had to actually do. Whether it was uploading information into our platforms, or trying to figure out how to translate the assessment for students because they weren't in person, that really wore teachers down. And so one of the things that Aquella really has been leading, and I've been trying to support and then translate as we do our acceleration work, is think about what is at the school level that the schools will manage, and whether it's through formative assessment or the interim assessment, that through the coaching and support the teachers get, they manage the data at that level. And then centrally, we figure out how to tap into that, as opposed to every single assessment after giving it and then scoring it. The teacher then has to pivot, put it in a platform. That can really eat away. I remember as a teacher having Scantron sheets and having to figure that out. And now whatever they use now, it's even, if we can take at least that off the plate, I think that wins us some space and gives teachers some grace to be able to focus on instruction. So I just wanted to add that we're really trying to prioritize how we can get our teachers to stay deep in their curriculum with their students and what they need, and take away what we can that may not necessarily be necessary. It might make life harder in some ways for us, but we'd rather have that than stressed out teachers breaking laptops because they're trying to figure out how to assess kids. So I wanted to just chime in with that as well.
But I feel like that type of support makes the process, Mr. Etienne, a bit easier for teachers to actually use that information to inform their instruction, right? So I appreciate you bringing that. Up. There were just two other things, Commissioner Griffin. I don't know if you were finished with your thoughts.
Oh yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
There were two other things that I was thinking about. We saw a lot of and I'll probably make Commissioner Griffin a little angry with this, but we saw already the information really focused on language arts and math, those diagnostic assessments. But where are we, or what is the plan for the other, and maybe I missed it in the appendix, but what are the other what is the guidance for the other content areas in providing those diagnostic assessments, whether blended in their daily instruction or somehow, what is the plan for diagnostics, formative assessment for teachers outside of language arts and mathematics? Because that's something that I missed.
Sure. I can start, and then I'd like to hand it off to both Chief Dabrowski and Executive Director James, because they've been in this longer than I have. What I've learned as I've started in the role is we clearly have more tools to do the diagnosing of prerequisite skills and formative assessment in literacy and math than we do in science and social studies. But we do have some things, and based on the amount of time we've been able to afford schools and teachers to deliver in science and social studies content, teachers may or may not know, and school leaders may or may not know exactly what's available to them. So we're going to spend some time this summer refreshing, rediscovering what is available. And with Dr. Steiner, we're going to be looking at what we have that we can begin to use to diagnose and identify prerequisite skills, and then what we need to add. Because what we know is this is going to be a long-term recovery process. So my perspective as I'm entering this role in this work in this way is really just about figuring out what we have available to us and how to use it, while simultaneously through our professional learning opportunities, identifying our needs and then working with our curriculum partners to have them meet our needs. And if they can't, find other ways to address it, so that in year 2, we have all of your formative assessments in a schedule with clear guidance on how to use them. In literacy and math, we have this pretty clearly laid out. And I think that as teachers begin to see that we're continuing what we've already done, they'll build confidence. But I think that in science and social studies, we're in a different place. And I think that in high school, we're also in a different place. So it really comes down to just really getting normed and clear on what we have, and then working with our partners to build from there so that we have exactly what we need moving forward. Again, I think that both Chief Dabrowski and Executive Director James may have a little more to add on this, but from someone who's entering this in a new space, that's what I've been able to ascertain so far.
Appreciate that.
Yep, and Aquila, you can jump in for sure too, because I know you've been working closely with science and social studies. And I mean, I certainly know that they are prepared to embrace the same approach of accelerated learning. And our social studies colleagues do have some of that prerequisite assessments already in place. And I know science is working because it's very content driven. There's some modifications. And I think the exciting thing is, and I think Mark and Aquila and all of us are really wanting to make sure that we take this moment also not to marginalize science and social studies, that they need to be lifted up in the space of ELA and math in service of making sure that there's opportunities for students to access knowledge across disciplines. So I think that commitment is going to be reflected in how we do the work, and the pace of it might look different because we are in a different space for ELA and math. But I think our conviction around making sure we prioritize social studies and science right along with it is one that we're on for this coming year.
Well,
Yeah,
Chief, all due respect, you guys have said it already. I have nothing to add.
yeah, and I think we'll look forward to hearing, more of it throughout the course of the year, at least the way that we've really looked at this committee calendar throughout the course of the year. I know there are spaces for us to have these ongoing discussions, so certainly looking forward to that. And then finally, I don't want to belabor the time. Um, there were some footnotes on the bottom of maybe one or a couple of the slides that specify that a lot of this strategy is for our traditional schools. Um, I'm going to ask about charter schools because I want to know what their assessment strategy is. And if we could somehow, and I know that it's kind of separate, I know that they're charters, I know that they develop their own curriculum and assessment plans, but I just think about, are there some things that we could learn from some of our charters that are in the school system? Are there, whether they are positive things or whether they aren't so positive? I think it could support our overall strategy. And I know that that might be, it might spark whatever feeling from whoever, but I think that there's something to consider there. In addition to our students that happen to transition from our charter schools and they transition to our traditional schools, how are we then able to use whatever assessment information that they may have had in their charters, and how are we able to seamlessly, as much as possible, transition them into our traditional school program and vice versa? I just think of that as we move forward. Just how do we also consider the and I know it's probably different for almost all of the charters, right? But it was just something that sparked a light bulb in my brain. Like, we can't just, those young people are a part of city schools as well as the students in our traditional school programs, even though I understand the charter process and I get it. That was just a thought that I had. Not that anyone has to chime in right now, but it could potentially be for follow-up. Christian and Tanisha, if you are there, that could be something there for follow-up.
Thanks, Commissioner McFadden. So I do have for follow-up, right? You want to know how much time is being spent on assessment. And this one you might want for future follow-up.
Yeah, and I see Chief Jones. She's back with us, so I'm sure she may contribute something before I officially ask for that for follow-up. Chief Jones.
Yes, so two things I just wanted to clarify as I'm listening to your request. So one, in terms of the assessment strategy, I want to acknowledge that it includes both the district decisions around assessment as well as state decisions around assessment. I just want to acknowledge first and foremost that because charters do have to participate in the state assessments, that the board does receive a compliance report that allows them to see how their assessment performance plays out, so that just for the public, like, there's no absence of the charter's assessment data as it relates to assessments when it comes to the state, partly because it is a compliance requirement. We put that forward so that people can actually see how do the charters perform as well as our other schools, so that people have a better understanding around how we're doing in our portfolio.
I appreciate.
So I want to acknowledge.
Yep, I appreciate you raising that because, and especially for the sake of the community, just knowing that piece of information, I think, is really important. And that happens, Chief Jones, that happens separately from like a renewal process. So we'll get that.
Correct.
Exactly. Okay. So we'll get that compliance report separate from any renewal so that we can have a picture of how how our students are doing in more real time than just waiting for 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 or whatever the year for the renewal process is. That's
right.
helpful.
I just wanted to acknowledge it. So that IHBJ charter and operator policy is what governs that. And so assessments are just one component, but there is, as a part of that compliance requirement, the ability to see how schools are performing around a number of different indicators inclusive of assessment. So I just want to acknowledge that. But I think I heard the second point that you raised, which is also an opportunity for learning, which is as it relates to how are charters using assessments in conjunction with their instructional strategies. Are there things that we can learn from them? And if so, one of the ways to facilitate that would be for us to have a better understanding around what those specific details are. So is that what you were really getting at, or am I overreaching to go that far?
I think that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think for Christian, for purposes of your follow-ups, like we can certainly, like, you know, as you bring that back to staff as a follow-up, we can work with the Office of New Initiatives to see how we might be able to follow through on that request. And then I'll also say we have had prior discussions with them and some success in some instances of getting access to other data along the way. So I think there are multiple opportunities there, but I appreciate you raising it here. Because we have a lot of work to do in the upcoming year. So the more we can learn from our sisters within the portfolio, that's probably not a bad idea. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Chief Jones. And could I ask Anthony Felder, if you can hear me, if you can turn your camera off, it's moving and it's distracting quite a bit. Thank you. Thank you all for that. Any more questions, Commissioner Griffin? Great. So I think we're ready for, thanks to staff and everyone for, I know that this is a lot of work and a lot of the, mandates for assessment really are outside of our control, but I think we've got to focus ourselves in doing what is best for our children. And that is a part of knowing what their needs are. So we do have to go through an assessment process. Of sorts in order to figure that out, to make sure that we're supporting them in growing their skills and meeting their needs. So I appreciate everyone for the work. Ms. James, Aquila James, I appreciate your work and everyone's work in this process. And we look forward to hearing more about it throughout the course of this particular school year and beyond. And with that, we're ready for procurement. As we think about the strategies, the R3 strategy, the R3 plan, when I think about the assessment strategy, how can some of these, like in here, we see tutoring, we see some enrichment programs. So I'm also curious to know how this all aligns, if that makes sense. So we hear about the assessment, but then as a result of the diagnostics and the assessment, how are we then structuring our enrichment programs and our tutoring programs to support all of that? So I think it's a nice marriage to have both that presentation and then to look at these particular procurement items here. So it looks like Ms. Wilson, Jessica's with us. Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We have 6 items on the agenda today, and there are members of the staff here that may be able to address some of that opening remark questionnaire for you as well. The first item is digital tools. This is a requirements contract we're putting in place for the first time this year, and this is one of those examples of things we learned from the period we've just gone through with COVID. So this was a demand that kind of changed, and so several of the team members put together a solicitation to be able to have a list of items or a list of vendors for the schools to be able to purchase these types of services from. So this contract term is from July 1, 2021 through June 30th, 2024, and it's for $1,104,600. And there's a variety of vendors that are included in this, and we've estimated it based on kind of just an idea of what the demand might be for each of these items.
At the bottom of this letter, it says that this procurement aligns with strategic priority 1. What does that mean?
So the board has the strategic priorities that they have identified, and so the office that is responsible for this identified this as aligning with strategic priority 1 for the board.
And I know that, but I would like to actually know, like briefly, for example, Chief Jones, when she went through the assessment strategy, definitely indicated which priorities, each of those 3 buckets. She kind of gave a description of those. It would be helpful if that could be colored just a little bit more. So I'm glad that we're making progress and making sure that we are now focusing these priorities to these board letters. It would be nice to just see a little bit of the how, just specified or summing up what the letter is kind of saying there. because not only are we looking at these, but I think the public has access to these as well. So I think that would be helpful, if that makes sense.
We can take that feedback and work with the offices to see if there's a better way to represent their the strategic priorities in the board letters.
Great, I appreciate that.
The second item on the agenda is the innovations for learning. This is the first item you'll see under component A of a PQS process that we recently completed. It's the estimated total of the contract is for $7.5 million with a contract term through August 25th, 2021 through August 24th, 2024.
Okay. And Commissioner Griffin, if you have any questions, please just, you can go ahead and interject.
Yeah, absolutely. My question is really about procurement 2 and 3. And I know we haven't hit number 3 yet, the literacy lab, but I see that like innovations for learning and literacy lab are both addressing literacy and through tutoring and after school programming. And so I was curious about why we chose 2 different ones and what distinct service are they providing that's different? Is it different schools? Is it capacity? Like one organization has more capacity than the other. Are there different grades? Like I was just curious about that information a little bit more.
So I'll say a broad answer to that. Well, before other folks jump in from the departments that have mentioned that, is that when we do this PQS process, the goal is to generate kind of a group of vendors that could meet different school needs. So we don't, the idea is to have multiple options for schools to choose from. As far as the specific questions about differentiating between the 2 vendors, I would defer to the academics team that went through the process to provide specifics on that.
Okay.
Commissioner Griffin, my name is Josh Bailey. I can answer that now, or Jessica, would you prefer I share that for the end, or save that for the end, rather?
I think you can talk about some of the like broad ideas of how they go through the process and the differentiation of vendors.
Sure, of course. So good afternoon. I'm Josh Bailey. I'm the Director of Operations for the Office of Teaching and Learning. And so this will directly answer your question, Commissioner Griffin, and then Commissioner McFadden, I think, provide some context to your point about using data and assessment for these vendors. So directly, Commissioner Griffin, IFL, we don't have exact plans for right now in terms of who or where they are going. But the point is to add them to Jessica's sort of assertion of, to the mix of potential vendors that then we can align down the road if there is a need for them. More explicitly, the Literacy Lab, this contract is for a specific program called the Leading Men Fellowship. So there is sort of a difference between some of the programs provided. So the focus of the content might be different, but the way that the vendors get to that goal might be a little bit different. And so specifically for the Literacy Lab, that is sort of their specific approach, is the Leading Men Fellowship, which both addresses the pipeline of Black educators, but then also their overarching support for early literacy. And Jalima Alisea and her team has been working with me and my team to make sure that all of our tutoring supports are aligned to schools where that tutoring program would be best utilized. So she has been using data from schools and across the district to align Literacy Lab to one school and perhaps a different vendor to a different school based upon the needs of the students and the school in particular. So that was a lot, but I hope it has answered. And if not, please let me know what additional clarity I can provide.
That definitely did answer my question. I appreciate you, Josh, jumping in and saying that. It kind of gives me a little bit more color to, in my mind, what I'm hoping we'll start to see with this resource map that I know I keep bringing up to see like how we're utilizing all of our resources across the district. I think this plays a huge role in, like, we have this pot of vendors that we go to, and where do these pot of vendors go? Like, where does the Literacy Lab service already? Where will IFL service? Where will we be using these digital tools? Like, how is this procurement process that we have, and once it reaches the board, after we go ahead and okayed it, how does that show up in the district? So it's just me trying to make that through line to the schools. Yeah. But I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And then Jessica, I will turn it back to you. And if there's more questions, I can answer the other vendor questions as well.
Well, I think about in cases where we don't see the MWBE, like they're, so I believe it's like instructional materials not necessarily being eligible, I guess, is it, or for consideration for that? Is that right, Jessica?
So I will defer to the WBMB office for information on specific decisions around vendors, but in general, one of the areas where you can exempt vendors from WMB requirements, or exempt the solicitation, I should really say, is for instructional materials.
So in a case like the literacy lab, and I appreciate Josh Bailey coming on to talk about like more of what that program offers, we potentially wouldn't, we know that, I mean, they're generally men of color that are facilitating a lot of that program. So we wouldn't necessarily be that concerned about it in this particular letter, but in others, I just know that there may be potentially questions from the full board on Tuesday about this, so we should just be prepared to address those.
Well, we can certainly make sure that we're prepared. I will say, just as a point of reference for a lot of these PQS items, that we have a lot of nonprofits that participate, and by definition, a nonprofit isn't a WMBE. And so that is also something to keep in mind, that we may know a lot about the vendors themselves, but they can't get certified because they are a nonprofit.
And perhaps more of that color could be included in the section that discusses the MWBE portion that's on the letters. In cases like this, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. We can work on that with the WMBE office about how we can highlight some of those options as far as like the nonprofits and how that works with WMBE compliance.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
The next item is Axiom Educators. This is again part of that component A PQS on the tutoring and other supports for instruction, and it's again $7.5 million. With the same contract term of August 25th, 2021 through August 24th, 2024.
Really quick, Jessica, sorry to go back to the literacy lab. There is on page 8, it says ages at the bottom of page 8. It says ages 8 through 24. I know it's meant to say 18 through 24, but I don't want folks to get mixed up. It's under request to the board. I think it's like the 4th paragraph.
I see that. That is a typo. Thank you.
No problem at all. Just didn't want folks to get caught up in that, but I'm all good on Axiom. I don't have any questions there.
The next item on the agenda is it's Girl Scouts of Central Maryland. Again, one of the component A pieces of that PQS. The estimated total contract amount is $750,000 from August 25th, 2021 through August 24th, 2024.
Thank you. And the question that I have, just in thinking about kind of what Commissioner Griffin was saying with the map, the resource map, what comes to mind when I see something like this, I see things for our girls, I see things for our boys. I'm wondering if we have any enrichment programming like this for our students that are non-binary. I think that is just something for us to consider. I don't know if programs exist, but just thinking of ensuring that we have inclusive environments and we're focusing on expanding what equity means for us in city schools. I think it's important for us to have that lens when we're looking at enrichment programs for our young people that may not necessarily identify with programs with boys or programs with girls. So I just think it's something for us to consider. That's not for you, Jessica, of course, for a lot of the folks that are on this call listening. I think it's something important that we keep our lens on. And certainly within the next couple of years, we can start seeing more or seeking out, soliciting more programs that cater to the needs of all of our students, particularly those that I just referenced.
The last item on the agenda today is fitness, fun, and games. Again, part of that PQS process. It's a contract amount of $7.5 million from August 25th, 2021 through August 24th, 2024.
Is this a local organization? Do we know? Oh, Commissioner Reed, good afternoon. It's good to see you.
Good afternoon again. Yes, Commissioner McFadden, Fitness, Fun, and Games is a locally operated organization.
Okay, that's helpful. Because one thing that I was thinking about in seeing these, I know that a lot of these are going to be funded by the use of grants. It just makes sense. What comes to mind is when the pandemic initially happened, we had to kind of, and I'm saying this very, I don't want anyone coming after me, but we kind of had to change the way that we prioritize a lot of the partners that we were using because of just where we were. So it's good to see that we have some community-based organizations and vendors and companies coming back up, so that because folks in Baltimore or locally in this area kind of really know how to really serve the needs of the young people that exist in their communities. So it's just nice to know that that is an organization that is a local organization, especially with us potentially allowing schools to invest so much money into these programs. We want to yield the greatest benefit, and we kind of want to make sure that it's homegrown. So I appreciate that. Commissioner Reed, do you have anything for us before we wrap up?
Listening and learning. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Commissioner Reed. Jessica, is there anything else that we need to keep on our radar, or are we all good?
I think we're all set. Those were the only items on the agenda.
Thank you. Commissioner Griffin, you all right?
Yep, I'm all right. Thank you.
Great, perfect. I just want to let everyone know that our next meeting is not going to be on a Tuesday. And I'm just pulling that up. It will be during the week of Labor Day, of course. And that first day, that Tuesday, I believe, there's something happening. I think our students are coming back, that like there's something happening there. So we moved our next meeting to September the 9th. So I just want to make sure that everyone is aware of our next meeting being on Thursday, September 9th, instead of Tuesday, September 7th. And at that meeting, we will focus on the R3. It will be a comprehensive update. We'll be having those updates regularly. Thank you, Christian. It is Rosh Hashanah, which is why we're meeting on the Thursday instead of the Tuesday. Thank you for that. And then we'll be updated on middle and high school choice results. And so we'll be engaging in that process as we, to Commissioner Griffin, your point earlier, as we're thinking about that choice process as we move forward. This will kind of segue us into that season for a lot of our students. Are there any additional questions, thoughts, concerns? If not, we are out before 5. It's just a minute. Wouldn't this be lovely for all of our meetings to be done by then? Thank you, Chief Dabrowski, your team, and everyone else that is really working really hard and tirelessly for our young people. I just want to keep us centered on that. Everything that we do is about our children. It's about our future. And if we tend to their needs, our world will be so much better if we did that. So folks, have a great evening. And we will see you next time. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a good rest of the day.